On the morning of October 14, 2018, the heavy equipment operators for the City of Duluth Public Works Department were looking at a geologic nightmare. The city was widening a critical access road along the steep rocky bluffs that overlooked Lake Superior. The project was already 2 weeks behind schedule and $40,000 over budget. Right in the middle of the proposed right-of-way, half buried in the dense glacial till, was a massive granite erratic. It was a remnant of the last ice age, a solid mass of stone roughly the size of a single-car garage. The city engineers estimated its weight at somewhere near 60 tons. Standing on the cold asphalt, wrapped in a high-visibility jacket, was the lead civil engineer, a 32-year-old man named David Arris. He was staring at two massive, brand-new pieces of yellow iron. The city had deployed a pair of 30-ton crawler excavators, machines that cost a combined $500,000. They had spent the last 4 hours trying to pry the boulder loose. The operators had dug a trench around the base of the stone, positioned their heavy steel buckets against the granite, and pushed with every ounce of hydraulic force they had. The massive diesel engines roared. The hydraulic lines whined under immense pressure, but the rock didn't move. In fact, the sheer resistance of the stone had caused the tracks of both excavators to slip backward, gouging deep, ugly scars into the dirt. Arris checked his watch. He had just made the call to bring in a specialized blasting crew. They were going to drill the rock and shatter it with explosives, a slow, dangerous process that would add another week to the delay and cost the city an additional $15,000. As Arris was filling out the requisition forms on his clipboard, a rusted 1988 Ford F-250 pulled slowly onto the shoulder of the road. It was towing a heavy equipment trailer. Behind the wheel was a 71-year-old retired logger named Henry Cobb, and chained to the deck of the trailer was a machine that looked like it had been forgotten by time. It was a 1948 Caterpillar D82U. It had no cab, no roll cage, and bare rusted exhaust stacks. It produced roughly 130 horsepower at the drawbar. Arris watched the old man climb stiffly out of the truck. He looked at the antique crawler, then back at his two massive stalled excavators. Arris let out a short, tired laugh. He had 120,000 pounds of modern hydraulic force currently losing a fight to a rock, and the county had sent him a museum piece to help. David Arris wasn't an arrogant man, but he was a man who understood the modern metrics of force. He understood breakout capacity, hydraulic flow rates, and operating weight. He knew that when you hit an immovable object, you bring a bigger machine. But he didn't understand the specific physics of static friction, and he certainly didn't understand the mechanical history of the machine sitting on Henry's trailer. The modern excavators were designed to dig, lift, and swing. They used high-pressure fluid pushing against steel rams to generate force. But that force is dynamic and aggressive. When the operators pushed their buckets against the granite, they were trying to shock the stone out of the earth. But 60 tons of glacial rock, locked into packed dirt for 10,000 years, doesn't shock. The static friction holding the boulder in place was immense. When the excavators pushed, their tracks broke traction long before the rock broke its bond with the earth. Henry Cobb had spent 40 years pulling massive hardwood timber out of these very bluffs. He had bought that 1948 Caterpillar at an estate auction in 1974. The old D8 was built in an era when steel was heavy and horsepower was relatively low. It featured a naturally aspirated 6-cylinder diesel engine that turned at a remarkably slow 1,000 revolutions per minute. It didn't have the explosive breakout force of a modern hydraulic ram, but bolted to the heavy steel casing of the rear PTO was a Hister towing winch. It was a massive drum of wound steel, driven directly by the tractor's transmission through a series of heavy gear reductions. Henry knew that when the earth holds something that tightly, you don't push it, you don't try to bully it. You anchor down, multiply your force, and apply an unbreakable, continuous tension until the earth simply gives up. If you've been watching, you already know where this is going, or maybe you don't. Have you ever used a block and tackle system to move something your engine couldn't budge? I want to hear about it in the comments. And if you're new here and wondering what kind of channel this is, even if you've never stepped onto a construction site, You know what it feels like to watch someone with expensive tools try to brute force a problem that actually requires patience. Stick around, because the engineering behind how low horsepower winch systems move the unmovable is a masterclass in applied physics, and we're not done yet. But before Henry could show them, the city engineer had something to say. Henry walked over to the edge of the excavation cut. His boots crunched on the loose gravel. He didn't look at the expensive excavators. He looked only at the rock, studying the way it sat in the earth. Eris walked up beside him, holding his clipboard like a shield against the freezing wind. "Appreciate you stopping, Pop," Eris said, his tone carrying the polite dismissal of a man dealing with a distraction. "But we're done here for the day. We've got a blasting crew scheduled for Tuesday. That rock is anchored solid. My guys just put 90,000 pounds of breakout force against it, and all they did was dig themselves a hole." Henry turned and looked at the young engineer. He didn't seem bothered by the doubt. He just pointed a calloused, grease-stained finger toward the old yellow crawler sitting on the trailer. "You're trying to push it," Henry said, his voice quiet but carrying the heavy rasp of a man who had smoked unfiltered cigarettes for half a century. "You can't push a mountain, but I can drag it out of your way." Eris blinked, looking at the 1948 machine. It was a beautiful piece of history, sure, but it was ancient. It boasted barely 130 horsepower. To Eris, this was a simple math problem. "Sir, that rock weighs 60 tons, Eris said, letting the frustration bleed into his voice. "Your tractor weighs maybe 17 tons. You don't have the mass and you don't have the horsepower. You hook a chain to that boulder, you're just going to burn out your clutch or drag yourself into the ditch." Henry didn't argue. He knew that modern engineering schools taught young men how to calculate hydraulic pressure, but they rarely taught them how to rig a mechanical advantage. "I'm not pulling it with the tracks," Henry replied smoothly, "and I'm not pulling it direct. Give me an hour to rig it. If it doesn't move, you can blow it up on Tuesday." Eris looked at his watch, then at the stalled project, and finally at the old man's unwavering gaze. "Fine," Eris sighed. "Have at it. But when you snap a cable, that's on you." What could a 70-year-old tractor possibly do that $500,000 of modern hydraulics couldn't? Henry walked back to his Ford pickup and dropped the heavy steel ramps on the trailer. Starting a 1948 Caterpillar D8 is not a simple turn of a key. It is a mechanical ritual. Henry climbed onto the steel tracks, opened the fuel valves, and pull-started the small two-cylinder gasoline pony motor. The little engine sputtered to life with a high-pitched rattle. Henry let it run for a few minutes, warming the water jacket of the massive diesel block. Then he engaged the heavy lever that linked the pony motor to the diesel. The massive pistons turned over, coughing thick white smoke into the cold Lake Superior air before the six-cylinder engine caught and settled into a deep, rhythmic, thundering idle. Henry backed the crawler off the trailer. The sheer weight of the machine cracked the frost on the asphalt, but he didn't drive it toward the boulder. Instead, he steered the D8 to the opposite side of the right-of-way. He positioned the tractor horizontally, facing away from the stone. Then he reached forward and dropped the massive steel front blade, burying it 2 feet deep into the frozen Minnesota dirt. He set the parking brakes. David Eris watched from the road, his brow furrowed. "He's facing the wrong way," the young engineer muttered to his foreman. But Henry wasn't trying to build a towing vehicle. He was building a deadman anchor. He knew that the Hister winch bolted to the back of the tractor possessed more pulling power than the tractor had traction. If he didn't anchor the machine, the winch would simply drag the 17-ton dozer backward across the dirt. Henry killed the throttle to a low idle and climbed down. He walked to the bed of his truck and unlatched a heavy wooden crate. Inside, resting on oil-soaked burlap, were 3 massive cast-iron snatch blocks. They were logging pulleys, forged in the 1930s, weighing nearly 90 pounds apiece. He wasn't going to pull the rock, he was going to multiply the iron. The rigging took 45 minutes of brutal, freezing physical labor. Henry didn't use the modern, ultralight synthetic ropes favored by the city crews. He used heavy greased 7/8-inch steel wire rope and massive forged iron logging chains. First, Henry dragged a thick, grade 80 iron chain around the base of the 60-ton glacial erratic, hooking it securely against a natural ridge in the granite. He shackled 2 of his massive cast-iron snatch blocks directly to this chain. Next, he walked across the right-of-way to a pair of towering, ancient white pine trees that stood well outside the blast zone. He wrapped thick, synthetic tree-saver straps around their massive trunks, anchoring his 3rd cast-iron pulley to the largest tree. Finally, he began to weave the wire rope. He pulled the heavy steel cable from the drum of the Hister winch on the back of the D8. He ran it across the dirt to the first block on the boulder, back across the road to the block on the pine tree, back to the second block on the boulder, and finally anchored the end of the cable to the trunk of the second pine tree. He had just built a 4-part line. By the absolute, unbreakable laws of physics, routing a cable through a series of moving pulleys creates a mechanical advantage. A 4-part line multiplies the pulling force of the winch by a factor of 4, while simultaneously dividing the pulling speed by 4. The mechanical Hister winch on the old Caterpillar D8 was rated for roughly 40,000 pounds of bare drum line pull. 40,000 pounds was less than half of what the modern excavators had applied. But multiplied by the exact geometry of the iron pulleys, Henry was suddenly capable of generating 160,000 pounds of pure, horizontal static dragging force. David Arris watched the old man check the shackles. The young engineer did the math in his head, and his eyes widened. He realized that the antique tractor wasn't just a machine, it was the anchor point for a massive kinetic equation. "You're going to snap that cable," Arris warned, stepping back from the web of tension. "If that rock doesn't give, that wire rope is going to part like a gunshot." Henry wiped grease from his leather gloves. "Steel rope only snaps when you shock it," he replied calmly. "We aren't going to shock it. We're going to ask it to move." At 10:45 a.m., the sky over Duluth was gray and heavy with impending snow. Henry climbed back onto the open steel deck of the 1948 Caterpillar. He didn't touch the heavy hand throttle. He left the massive 6-cylinder diesel engine running at a slow, steady idle. He reached behind his seat and gripped the tall iron lever that controlled the Hister towing winch. He didn't yank it. He engaged the clutch with the delicate, agonizing slowness of a watchmaker. Deep inside the heavy steel housing on the back of the tractor, the massive planetary gears meshed. The winch drum began to turn. The thick steel wire rope lying in the dirt began to rise. It didn't snap taut with a violent jerk. It tightened inch by inch, lifting out of the frost. Across the right-of-way, the heavy cast-iron pulleys groaned, physically shifting on their straps and chains as they aligned themselves perfectly with the load. The line went completely straight. It became a rigid bar of iron, vibrating gently under immense mechanical tension. The massive D8 crawler squatted hard against the earth. The heavy steel front blade bit deeper into the frozen trench. The entire 17-ton chassis of the tractor groaned as an incredible amount of force was transferred from the earth through the winch and into the steel frame. Henry held the winch lever perfectly steady. He was currently generating over 100,000 pounds of tension, but the 60-ton granite boulder wasn't moving. The static friction of the packed glacial till was fighting back, gripping the stone with 10,000 years of settled weight. The modern excavator operators, standing safely behind their massive yellow machines, watched the heavy steel cable trembling in the cold air. They crossed their arms, absolutely certain the old iron was about to shatter. But Henry knew his steel. He didn't pull harder. He didn't rev the diesel engine to shock the load. He simply held the tension mathematically constant. He sat perfectly still on the open iron seat, his hand resting lightly on the lever, feeling the exact weight of the mountain through the vibrations of his machine. For 8 terrifying minutes, the naturally aspirated diesel engine lugged. The steel lines hummed a low, terrifying mechanical note into the freezing air. Nothing moved. "It's not going anywhere," Arris whispered to his foreman. "The earth has it." Henry didn't say a word. He just waited for the geology to fail. At exactly 10:54 a.m., a sound cut through the steady, rhythmic clatter of the Caterpillar's engine. It wasn't the violent, deafening crack of breaking steel. It was a deep, earthly groan rising up from the bottom of the excavation cut. Down in the trench, the frozen, packed dirt that gripped the massive granite boulder began to fracture. Spiderweb cracks radiated outward through the soil. The static friction was finally failing. By pulling constantly and holding the static tension without jerking, Henry had applied a continuous horizontal force that the earth could not absorb forever. He hadn't ripped the rock out of the ground. He had literally torn the geological bond apart. David Arras dropped his hands, taking an involuntary step forward. Down in the dirt, the 60-ton glacial erratic physically shifted forward an inch. The D8 didn't change its pitch. Henry maintained the exact same steady winch speed, letting the four-part geometry do the heavy lifting. Another deep groan echoed from the trench, and the massive stone moved 3 inches, then a foot. Once the primary static friction was broken and the rock transitioned into kinetic motion, the actual dead weight of the boulder was easily overwhelmed by the 160,000 pounds of multiplied dragging force. The heavy steel wire rope spooled incredibly slowly, but flawlessly, onto the drum of the Hister winch. Henry reeled the massive stone across the right-of-way at a glacial pace. It was moving at less than 1 foot per minute. The granite boulder plowed forward through the frozen dirt, dragging a wave of topsoil with it, moving steadily out of the path of the new road. The modern excavator operators stood on the asphalt in complete silence. They were watching a 70-year-old tractor and a set of iron pulleys from the 1930s defeat a problem that $500,000 of modern hydraulic force could not budge. Because of the 4-to-1 mechanical reduction, the process was brutally long. For every 4 feet of wire rope the winch pulled in, the boulder moved only 1 foot. Every time the winch drum filled, Henry had to stop, set the brakes, slack the line, and reset the massive iron chain on the rock. Henry sat on the open tractor seat for 2 straight hours, his hands working the cold iron levers, the freezing wind coming off Lake Superior biting completely through his coat. He didn't have a heated cab to retreat to. He just had the quiet, unrelenting endurance of a man who knew exactly what it took to finish a job when everyone else had given up. By 1:15 p.m., the 60-ton glacial erratic had been dragged entirely clear of the city's right-of-way. It rested safely in the tree line, leaving behind a massive, deep furrow in the frozen dirt. Henry disengaged the power takeoff. The heavy Hister winch fell silent. The immense mechanical tension in the 7-8-inch steel wire rope went slack, dropping onto the frost-covered ground with a dull, heavy clank. The old logger didn't jump down from the tractor in triumph. He sat there for a long moment, letting his cold, grease-stained hands rest on his knees, his breath pluming in the gray afternoon light. David Arras walked over to the 1,948 crawler. The 32-year-old civil engineer looked at the massive stone, completely moved without a single stick of dynamite, and then looked up at the 71-year-old man who had just saved his budget and his timeline. The frantic energy and modern engineering arrogance were completely gone from David's face. "I owe you my schedule, Mr. Cobb," David said quietly. "If we had waited for the blasting crew, the winter would have shut this project down. What do I owe you?" Henry climbed slowly down the iron tracks, his heavy boots crunching on the frozen dirt. He reached out and unpinned the massive iron snatch block from the boulder's logging chain. "The rate is $600, Henry said, wiping his hands on a canvas rag. "And I'd appreciate a hand loading these pulleys back into my truck. They're getting heavier than they used to be." David stared at him. $600 was less than what the commercial blasting crew charged just for the site inspection. The lead excavator operator, the man who had spent 4 hours helplessly spinning his tracks against the rock, walked over in the cold. He didn't say a single word. He just bent down, picked up one of the massive 90-pound cast iron pulleys, and carried it heavily to the bed of Henry's Ford. His crew followed suit, silently packing away the old man's antique gear. They were seasoned professionals, and they knew exactly when they had been beaten by someone who possessed a deeper understanding of the earth. As David Arras wrote the check on the hood of his city truck, he looked at the rusted 1930s-era pulleys resting inside the wooden crate. He looked at the 1,948 Caterpillar crawler, its diesel engine ticking over smoothly in the freezing wind. "Why didn't you ever buy modern excavators?" David asked, handing the paper to the old logger. "With what you know about leverage, you could run a massive commercial earth-moving fleet. You could be making $10,000 a week doing this on a municipal scale." Henry folded the check slowly and put it in the chest pocket of his worn canvas coat. He looked out over the dark, frozen expanse of Lake Superior. "Because massive machines make you believe you don't have to wait," Henry said, his voice barely rising above the wind. When you owe $10,000 a month to a bank, you can't afford to be patient. You have to force the harvest. You have to force the rock. You run your excavators at maximum RPM because you are out of time. Henry patted the frozen yellow steel of his D8's fuel tank. But when your iron is paid off, time is no longer your enemy. You can afford to idle down. You can afford to let the earth breathe. I survived the 1980s logging crisis because I learned that you don't fight a mountain with a monthly payment. You let the pulleys do the math. David stood in silence. The younger man had spent his entire adult life equating debt with progress and explosive speed with efficiency. He had just watched a 71-year-old man with zero debt and infinite patience mathematically dismantle a problem that $500,000 of leveraged municipal capital could not solve. The recovery at the Duluth Bluffs was just a mechanical echo of that older, profound economic truth. The commercial operators had been insulated from the friction of the earth by their heated cabs and hydraulic joysticks, unable to feel the terrain fighting back until it was too late. Henry was exposed to the elements, but entirely free from the invisible, crushing grip of the banks. Henry Cobb passed away quietly in his sleep in the winter of 2023 at the age of 76. In rural logging communities, a patriarch's passing is usually followed by a familiar, tragic ritual, the estate auction. The auctioneer's white tents go up, the timberland is subdivided, the machinery is lined up in the driveway, and the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime is sold off for pennies on the dollar to men who only see scrap iron. It is the final victory of the debt cycle. But there was no auction at the Cobb property. Because Henry had never leveraged his land to chase massive commercial expansion, there was no bank waiting to demand immediate liquidation to cover outstanding notes. His timber acreage, his corrugated steel shop, and his museum of obsolete leverage were seamlessly legally transitioned to his grandson, Thomas. Thomas is a modern civil engineer. He works for the county, and he understands computer-aided design, geological soil mapping, and variable rate hydraulics. To a corporate liquidator, the old wooden machine shed on his grandfather's property was just full of heavy, worthless scrap iron. But Thomas grew up riding on the steel fender of that 1948 D8. He had watched his grandfather multiply 60-year-old horsepower to drag a 60-ton glacial erratic out of a hole that $500,000 of modern excavators couldn't touch. He understood that the rusted crawler and the grease-stained wooden crate full of cast-iron pulleys wasn't just obsolete logging equipment. It was the physical manifestation of the patience that had kept their family independent. Thomas didn't plan to scrap the crawler. He didn't plan to sell the pulleys. Why would you destroy the very anchor that kept your family from washing away? There is a profound difference between holding on to the past because you are afraid of the future and holding on to the past because it works better than the future in the moments that actually matter. The men who built these machines understood something fundamental about the earth. It cannot be rushed. If this story meant something to you, if you grew up with a machine like this one, or if you know someone who did, subscribe, because there are more stories like this one and they deserve to be told while the people who lived them are still here to tell them. Have you ever used a block and tackle system to multiply your pulling force when the engine wasn't enough? Leave it in the comments. I read every one. And the engineering behind how low horsepower winch systems conquered the American frontier is a masterclass in applied physics. That's the hidden truth we explore in the next story we're going to tell. The 1948 D8 is parked in the back of Thomas's shop today. It is fully fueled. The massive Hister winch is spooled perfectly tight with heavy steel wire rope, and the heavy wooden crate full of cast iron snatch blocks rests securely under a sturdy wooden workbench. The commercial contractors will keep pushing the absolute limits of civil engineering. They will keep bringing heavier excavators, faster trucks, and larger municipal budgets to the job site. And eventually, the frozen earth of the Great Lakes will give way again, and they will hit the absolute limit of what sudden, aggressive force can accomplish. When they do, the old iron will be ready. Henry Cobb's legacy is still sitting exactly where it belongs. And every autumn, when the frost hardens the ground and the massive modern machinery rolls past the county line, the rusted yellow iron is waiting in the dark. That's what happens when you build in silence while the world laughs.